So, the Switch 2 is here. We've had it for a few weeks now, and after 25 years of growing up with this franchise, watching it move from console to console, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at what Pokémon is likely going to look like over the next few years across this new generation of Nintendo hardware. I've been very busy putting together a list of predictions, things that I think are likely to happen, just based on my experience in the industry over the last few years, seeing how the Pokémon company operates, and also just as a fan of the series. But I've also been thinking about things that I'm both hopeful for, things that either I would just personally really like to see, or things that I think would be beneficial for the series, especially with how fans are sort of currently feeling about it, as well as some fears of what could happen. Things that are definite possibilities that aren't out of the question, but things I really hope the Pokémon company avoids. Let's hope they're watching. Now, this video is a sequel of sorts to my recent looking back at 8 years of Pokémon on Switch video, which quite obviously look back at the past 8 years. So now it's time to try and predict the future. So wish me luck as I try not to make a complete fool of myself, and feel free to share your own predictions, your own hopes and fears in the comments below. Right, before we get on to the crazy fun stuff in the hopes and fears section, let's kick things off with predictions. And I'm going to start with one that's so blindingly obvious I almost feel bad having it on the list at all, and that is that Pokémon Generation 10 will launch on Switch 2. I'm allowed one safe prediction, right? New generations of Pokémon games have launched on Nintendo handheld consoles since the dawn of time itself, with either one or two Pokémon generations launching for each system. More recently, it's been that we've had 2 generations per console, and with Gens 8 and 9 launching for the original Switch, and with the Switch 2 already on the market, it's almost a 100% certainty that Gen 10 will be on Switch 2. Going by the usual trend of new generations arriving every 3 to 4 years, and considering that Scarlet and Violet, which was Generation 9, launched in 2022, maybe I should at least add a little bit of jeopardy to this prediction by adding a footnote of sorts. So, let's say Gen 10 not only launches on Switch 2, but that it launches specifically in 2026. We have Legend ZA launching later this year in 2025, so that rules out a 2025 release for me. And obviously Gen 10 hasn't even been revealed yet, so we're going to need some time. So Gen 10 on Switch 2, early 2026 reveal, late 2026 launch. Done. Okay, prediction 2. I think we'll see continued cross-platform Pokémon games for at least the first couple of years of Switch 2. Now, unless I'm just forgetting everything, Pokémon hasn't really done this before, where new games are released for both the current console on the market and the previous generation of console. But I do think that could change here with Switch and Switch 2. We already know that Legend ZA, the next Pokémon game on the horizon, is going to do this with both a standard version launching for the original Switch, and then a Switch 2 edition that will offer better performance. But I'm not sure that it'll end there. Now, when it comes to something as major as Gen 10, which we've just been discussing, maybe that really will be a Switch 2 only kind of deal. Let's face it, Nintendo is going to want to drive as many sales as possible of the new Switch 2, and having an exclusive new mainline Pokémon game for the system has always been a great way of doing that. But smaller releases, so things like Pokémon Champions, which we still don't know that much about yet, and if there are any other smaller scale projects in the works that we haven't been told about yet, with games like that, I think there's a very strong chance we'll see them appear on the eShop as both a Switch 2 game, but also playable on Switch 1, even if that version ends up being slightly inferior to the edition available on Switch 2. I could be completely wrong here, and if that's the case, then I'll accept that. But obviously, the Pokémon company can have its own say from a publishing perspective, especially with these smaller releases that I'm talking about. And so, whilst Nintendo might not be doing it with their sort of major releases at the moment, we have seen other companies like Sony launching its biggest games across both its newer PS5 and the older PS4. We're talking huge games here like the God of War franchise, Horizon. So if there's more money to be had by launching a game on both Switch 2 and Switch, and bearing in mind that the original Switch obviously has a huge audience at the moment, which the Switch 2 doesn't have just yet, then yeah, I can definitely imagine the Pokemon Company taking the Sony route and wanting to take advantage of those extra sales. Prediction 3. This is very similar to the first prediction, but with a bit more risk attached. And that is that we won't just get Gen 10 on Switch 2, but we'll also get Gen 11. With Gen 10 not even being an official thing yet, the very idea of even thinking about Gen 11 being a thing that will one day exist is just weird. But unless the very fabric of reality changes over the next few years, then it does make sense that at some point we'll be playing Gen 11 Pokemon games on Switch 2. As I touched upon earlier, each Nintendo hardware cycle has previously received either 1 or 2 generations of Pokemon, but it's been 2 consistently now for quite some time. Ever since the DS, if I'm not forgetting something, which obviously had Gens 4 and 5 available on it. If my first prediction turns out to be right and we do see Gen 10 at some point in 2026, I'd say we'd likely be looking at somewhere around 2029 or 2030 for Gen 11, which don't even sound like real years that are going to exist. But yeah, we'll be looking at somewhere around there for Gen 11. The Switch 2 console obviously launched in 2025, so as long as that console is still the main hardware on the market in 5 years' time, which I'd guess it would be, even if that's a Switch 2 Pro or a Switch 2 OLED or something further down the line, then yeah, I see no reason why Gen 11 won't be on Switch 2. Okay, 2 more predictions before I get onto the hopes and fears section. And this next one is that we'll get 1 or 2, more than 2? Maybe more than 2 games that are compatible with Switch 2 and mobile devices. The Pokemon Company is clearly quite keen on mobile gaming at the minute, and it's doing really well from it as well. Obviously, Pokemon Go has been ridiculously successful, and now Pokemon trading card game Pocket is really popular as well. When I was making the video looking back at every Pokemon game on Switch, it kind of made me realise that there was more Switch and mobile crossover than I sort of think about, and I can only see that increasing in the future. Pokemon Unite is perhaps the best example of what I'm talking about here. A game that you can play on either your console or on mobile. We know that Pokemon Champions is a battle-based game being developed for both the Switch 1 and mobile. So assuming it's probably quite safe to predict that Pokemon Champions will also run on Switch 2, then we might already be able to tick off one game that fits this prediction already. But I do think there could well be a few more as the years roll on by. Okay, last prediction before we get on to the fun stuff. And that is there has to be something nostalgic on Switch 2 for Pokemon's 30th anniversary. If you're unaware, February 2026 will be the 30th anniversary of when the very first Pokemon games launched in Japan. You'd imagine there'll be all sorts of planning and preparation going on for that within the company as we speak, and nothing sells quite like nostalgia, does it? And yes, I'm speaking from first-hand experience. Pokemon's first generation is the very definition of nostalgia for a lot of people, myself included. So my guess is that something Gen 1 related should probably happen. If you're the type who spends enough time on the internet, you may well have seen fans talk about a theoretical Pokemon Classics collection, a release that would, theoretically, put Pokemon's first 3 generations onto one cartridge on Switch. It did the rounds a while back because people got overhyped for it after they saw it, I guess, even though it was just a fan-made mock-up. But I can understand the appeal. Now, I personally think that's too much. I don't think the Pokemon Company would be as generous as that, offering so many of their classic, iconic games in one go for one price like that. But it's hard to deny that this anniversary really would be the ideal time to do something along those lines. Maybe a more realistic prediction would be, instead of having all 3 of those early generations, this could be a collection of just Gen 1, but it'd be some fancy limited edition thing with merch and all sorts attached to it to increase the value. Or maybe we'll just finally see the classic Pokemon games appearing on Nintendo Switch Online as part of the Game Boy catalogue. I think that's probably a safer bet, but I must admit it would be cool to have a modern physical release of the older games. The batteries in my old gold and silver cartridges have just died now. So all the real-time features like the clock and the day-night cycle and everything just don't work anymore. So having a modern physical cartridge of those again in some form, rather than just part of a subscription that obviously we'll all lose access to one day, that would kind of appeal to me actually. We'll see. Okay, let's move on to some more fun discussion, some more kind of out there, more speculative hopes and wishes maybe for the future. I'll kick off this hopes section with what is probably my biggest hope of all for the franchise, and that is that we see continued experimentation with new ideas and new directions for the series. In my last video, I spent a decent chunk of time talking about how much I appreciated Game Freak trying to shake things up a bit with Pokémon Legends Arceus on the original Switch. It really does feel somewhere between a mainline game and a spin-off, because you can sort of see the DNA of what has to be in a mainline game there, but so much was also just thrown out of the window and new ideas were allowed to shine, and it made for a really fresh experience. We do have Legends ZA coming soon, of course, so I'm glad that the Legends series will continue, but my hope here is that it doesn't stop there. I hope Game Freak really embraces the success that Legends Arceus had and realise that there'll always be potential on completely new takes on the series. If I want to play the classic Pokemon formula, the old games are always there to scratch that itch, so we don't need the same games to be made over and over again. Give us new stuff, keep being creative, don't get tied down thinking that each game has to be a certain way. So yeah, that's what I really hope to see from Game Freak over this next console generation. Will it happen? Who knows? Okay, hope number 2, and this is where I started to let my mind just run a little bit wild. So, Pokemon fans, and gaming fans in general actually, seem to love nostalgia. Games and series that launched in their childhood or over years gone by, and I'm one of them, someone who looks back at games like that just really fondly. So what I really hope we see is the revival of an old, dormant Pokemon spin-off series. I had a quick look at my collection earlier just to see which spin-off in particular I'd love to see make a comeback, and I settled on Pokemon Pinball. How cool would it be to have a new Pokemon Pinball game on Switch 2? For anyone unaware, we only had 2 pinball games, one on Game Boy Color and one on Game Boy Advance. But the Pokemon universe works quite nicely in a pinball game, with a Pokeball being the ball that you ping about, and you knock the Pokeball into Pokemon to catch them and stuff. They're genuinely quite enjoyable games. So hear me out here. Hope number 2 is that we get a brand new Pokemon pinball game that ties in to the current generation of Pokemon, which, if my predictions turn out to be right, will be Generation 10. I'm going to go all out with this, so the hope is the game will be called Pokemon Pinball X, with the X sort of representing the 10 of Generation 10, and it will feature Pokemon from all 10 generations. Not all of them, just some from each one. Now, if all of that comes true, that very specific set of hopes or predictions or whatever you want to call it, then someone needs to sign me up to NASA or something. It is worth noting though that Pokemon Snap was revived for the Switch 1. So maybe a revival of a series we haven't seen for years and years isn't actually out of the question on Switch 2. Okay, hope number 3 is another one of these bigger picture type hopes. And that is, I really hope, and this will never happen, but I would really love to see the Pokemon Company ditch its current production and development cycle. What I'm talking about here is the fact that Pokemon operates on a 3 to 4 year cycle. During that time, a new generation of Pokemon is launched, meaning the new games come out, new merch, new trading cards, anime, everything. It all has to be delivered on time to coincide within those 3 to 4 years. From a business point of view, with Pokemon being this huge monstrous machine of capitalism, yeah, I get it. But from a quality control perspective, we have already seen the negative impact of this over the last few years. Recent games like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet on Switch 1 just haven't been up to scratch on a technical and performance level. And I think the biggest shame about that is that the developer's original vision just clearly can't be realised. I think people who consider Game Freak to not be up to standard are kind of missing the point a bit. And I think that if the studio was actually given the same amount of time that other leading studios in the games industry are given, and if the Pokemon Company could figure out a way of keeping all of its different departments in line and on time, but just to a more relaxed timescale, then I think we'd all get much better products and better video games as a result. And also, it really wouldn't hurt for Pokemon to just slow down a bit anyway. I can't believe how quickly new trading card game expansions come around, for example. I don't know how anyone manages to keep up with it anymore. The Pokemon Company has more than enough money already, so just slow down just a touch. Allow the games to have a development time that's more in line with what's needed these days. AAA games are usually developed over 5 or more years these days, and everything will be better off. It will never happen. Okay, hope number 4, and this is another brand new game kind of hope, and that is Let's Go Johto. Now, I'm aware this isn't exactly an original idea. Just wait for the next hope if you want something that's out there. But I've been wanting a Let's Go sequel ever since I reached the credits on Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. There are a couple of things about the original Let's Go games that I think let them down a little bit, but overall I did really love them. They were nostalgic, but also sort of back to basics in a good way, and I thought they were utterly gorgeous as well. Can you imagine Gold and Silver's Johto region remade looking like this, with legendary encounters receiving cutscenes like this? Imagine seeing Lugia at the Whirl Islands or Ho-Oh flying around the bell tower in 4K on Switch 2. I just need it. I need it. Also, the collector and perfectionist in me finds it weird that now Gen 1 technically has the original and then 2 remakes, whereas every other gen just has its 1 remake. So we need a complete set of Let's Go games anyway, just to satisfy my ridiculous brain. So if you are watching Game Freak, then yes please. Okay, as promised, let's go for one that is bonkers. My 5th and final hope on the list, before we jump over to the final section, my fears for the future. This last hope is that we get some form of Pokemon card. Yes, as you can see from my incredible Photoshop skills, I'm talking about a Mario Kart equivalent for the Pokemon series. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud to a camera like this, and it also sounded ridiculous when I was first writing down all these ideas and being very clearly judged by one of my cats. But the more I think about it, the more I do think it actually makes a bit of sense. To explain, it doesn't have to be exactly Mario Kart. I just mean some kind of Pokemon racing game, but obviously I am picturing the sort of cutesy visuals and party style racing gameplay that you'd get from Mario Kart or Sonic Racing or Crash Racing, that sort of thing. Would you have Pokemon driving go-karts like Cow in Mario Kart World? Would you have trainers riding Pokemon with the Pokemon themselves doing the racing? Could you have Pokemon riding on other Pokemon? Could you have a triathlon? You ride a Rapidash on land, hop on a Lapras to get over a lake, and then ride a Cyclizar for the bike bit to finish. You see what I mean? There's potential here, right? Is this the worst idea of all time? Or is it the best? Pokemon Kart Switch 2 2028. Make it happen. Okay, from the highs of Pokemon Kart World Tour 8 Deluxe to the lows of what I really hope we don't see happen on Switch 2. Here are my fears for Pokemon on Switch 2. Now this first fear is one that I'd imagine most Pokemon fans actually would just agree with anyway, and that is that the next mainline Pokemon game turns out to be a Scarlet and Violet 2.0. And by that I mean we end up getting another release that seems like it just didn't have enough development time. Corners were cut and we're left with something that's just a bit disappointing. Now, I guess this is sort of the opposite of one of the hopes I mentioned, that the Pokemon Company would ditch or at least calm down that constant development cycle that it goes through at the moment. It's been said countless times by so many people, but it's just bizarre and disappointing that a franchise owned by one of the richest, most successful entertainment companies in the world has been releasing video games that just don't match up with where the industry's at. Pokemon games should be the absolute pinnacle of gaming. The money's there, the guaranteed sales are there, so it's not like there's even much of a risk to funnel more money and time into a project. I don't know, it feels quite clear that the constant need to have new products and have everything lined up on time is very much the focus. And if that results in another mainline series game that's disappointing on a technical level, I think that's just really sad. So yeah, I really don't want another technically poor Pokemon game that feels a few years behind. Fun and the gameplay itself should absolutely always be, the most important part of a game, but Pokemon games really should be at the forefront of the industry on a technical level as well. So please don't let us down. Fear number 2. Ever since X and Y on the 3DS, each new mainline game has had a new battle gimmick. Something that either has a major impact on how you have to battle within that specific game, or something that changes the way Pokemon look through new evolution or whatever. I do have this fear that one day the need for a new gimmick will just go too far and we'll end up with something that just completely ruins how some fan favourite Pokemon look, or maybe something that even just destroys the whole balance of Pokemon battling altogether. Looking back, we had Mega Evolution in Gen 6, Z-Moves in Gen 7, Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing in Gen 8, and then Terastallization in Gen 9. Each time these have been revealed, I felt kind of skeptical at first, before slowly getting used to the idea and just accepting it. But I am always left with the feeling that I'd be just as happy to not really have them. And you're very welcome to disagree with me on this, by the way. I know that there are people out there that absolutely love them too, that's fine. But yeah, they really have me torn, because I like that they're trying new things and I appreciate that they make an effort to make sure it kind of works within the lore of each region as well. But messing around with the battle system or the appearance for fan favourite Pokemon with new forms and things like that is a bit of a dangerous game to play, in my opinion. So, assuming we are probably going to be getting more of these gimmicks going forward, please don't let them get out of control. And also please, don't release any more forms of Charizard. We have enough. Okay, so I don't really believe this will happen, but oh god, what if it did? And that is, what if Generation 10 is the end of new Pokemon designs? Now, before you say that I've completely lost the plot, I'm not saying that this is the end of Pokemon games, but could the Pokemon Company look at the series they have and think, right, we have 10 mainline entries, a nice round number, a complete collection, over 1,000 Pokemon, maybe it's time to drop the format and change things up. I appreciate that having this as a fear on my list is a bit ironic, considering I've been banging on about wanting them to be experimental with new ideas and stuff, but it is a scary thought. Will they one day think that, look, there are loads of Pokemon, we don't need to design anymore, we should just focus on the 1,000 we already have and just keep doing remakes, or just use random selections of Pokemon we already have for every new game we make going forward? And is that really out of the question? There aren't many series I can think of, if any, that have such a huge roster of characters that fans expect to be present all the time in every game. And the bigger it gets, the more Pokemon that are designed, surely the worse this problem becomes. But then again, new Pokemon bring new possibilities for things like merch, new levels of hype for new products. So can they ever even stop if they wanted to? I honestly don't know which is worse. No new Pokemon ever again, or just new Pokemon for the rest of time until we have 50,000 of the things and no one can remember them and it's all a nightmare. Okay, 2 more fears to go, and this one is, I guess, a bit more serious than the ones that I've mentioned previously. And that fear is that Pokemon games start to embrace AI to the point where they're just unrecognisable. If you keep up to date with gaming news and tech news, you've probably seen lots about the dangers of AI already, with people losing their jobs, developers, designers, writers, artists, anyone doing anything creative really, and also an increase in new games that are just AI slop. Just completely AI generated nonsense that doesn't have any level of human creativity attached to it at all. Now, I don't mean to start a whole AI debate here. it has good uses and bad uses, and it's much more about how people and society decide to use it. But I absolutely do not want to see a future where Game Freak just gets rid of the majority of its designers and asks AI to design new Pokemon, for example. With AI being quite a broad term, it's worth noting here that I'm not referring to the sort of AI that's essential for games and has been there for decades. You know, systems that developers design to have wild Pokemon and trainers battle against you and make decisions and things like that. You know, what we always used to call computer players, stuff like that. I'm talking specifically about replacing what humans have typically done, creators, designers, etc., and having AI just generate everything from art to dialogue. I'm very much of the opinion that anything creative, anything that is an art form, which video games definitely fall into, should be made by people. Real people. Okay, the final fear. And thank you for sticking with me right through to the end if you're still watching. Let's go for a fear that is utterly ridiculous. What if Pikachu... What if Pikachu gets replaced? Pikachu has been Pokemon's mascot from pretty much the very beginning, and it's obviously one of the most famous characters in the world. But what if, during this next era of Pokemon, the company decides that actually Pikachu's time is up? A couple of years ago, I wouldn't have even dared suggest this as an idea for fear of being laughed out of the community altogether. But may I just remind you that after, I think it was 26 years of also being the face of Pokemon, they decided to retire Ash Ketchum as the star of the anime. Sure, he's not quite on the same level as Pikachu, but for anyone who grew up on multiple areas of the franchise, so including the animating things rather than just playing the games, Ash was essentially a mascot of the series too. I couldn't believe it when they said he was getting replaced. They'd gone through 25 whole seasons of the show with him essentially just being a 10-year-old that doesn't age, so why stop there? But no, gone. A childhood hero and icon thrown in the bin. I couldn't believe it. So, what if Pikachu's next? What if the Pokemon company decides Pikachu's getting a little bit outdated and they want to try a new start? It sounds impossible, and yeah, okay, it probably is. But they've done it to Ash, and Pikachu could be next. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video right through to the end. If you liked it and you want to dive into another lengthy discussion, make sure to check out that looking back at 8 years of Pokemon on Switch video that I've mentioned, which reminisces over every single Pokemon game that launched for Switch. There were probably a few more than you realise or that you remember. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Please also consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It really helps me out, it helps the channel to grow, and it also means you won't miss any future videos coming up on the channel too. Let me know your own predictions, hopes and fears for Pokemon on Switch 2 in the comments below, and that's about everything. So thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one.